The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the mountain fortress, a deep, ancient chill that seeped through the thin soles of her worn-out slippers and settled into her bones. Ilara had never known true warmth. She was an unclaimed, a ghost haunting the edges of the Great Hall, her existence marked only by the tasks she completed. Scrubbing flagstones until her knuckles were raw, hauling buckets of icy water from the well, and keeping her eyes downcast. Always downcast. To be unclaimed in the Skyfang pack was to be less than nothing. It meant she had no family, no standing, no future beyond a lifetime of servitude. She was a whisper in the roaring life of the king's fortress, easily ignored and just as easily extinguished. She had learned long ago that survival depended on invisibility. She made herself small, quiet, a shadow to be stepped over and forgotten. Her world was a palette of grays and whites, gray stone, gray wool, white snow clinging to the high-arched windows. The only color came from the vibrant banners of the Alpha King, Theron, whose sigil of a black wolf against a silver mountain hung in every hall. She had only ever seen him from a distance, a towering figure of immense power, his presence a physical force that made the very air crackle. He was as remote and merciless as the mountain itself, his face carved from granite, his eyes the color of a winter storm. Every wolf in the pack feared him, respected him, and obeyed him without question. He was their king, their alpha, the heart of their strength. But Ilara felt something else when his gaze swept a room, something far colder than fear. She felt an emptiness, a profound and hollow loneliness that seemed to radiate from him like the chill from the stone. She saw it in the moments he thought no one was watching, a flicker of profound weariness in his hard eyes before the mask of command slammed back into place. She told herself it was a fantasy, a story spun by a lonely girl who saw her own feelings reflected in a man who would never know her name. Her duties often took her near the royal wing, a place where most servants scurried through with their heads bowed low. But Ilara was often assigned the most undesirable tasks, and one of those was cleaning the outer kennels where the king's personal guard housed their wolves. It was here, one night, that everything changed. A sound tore through the quiet dark, a sound of such profound agony it stole the breath from her lungs. It wasn't the howl of a normal wolf. It was a deep, guttural sound of a soul being ripped apart. It came from the king's private gardens, a place forbidden to all but him. Fear screamed at her to run, to hide, to pretend she had heard nothing. But the sound came again, laced with a pain so terrible it bypassed fear and went straight to her heart. Something was dying. Something magnificent was in its final throes. She didn't make a conscious choice. Her feet simply moved, carrying her through a service gate and into the frosted, moonlit garden. And there she saw him. Not the king, but his wolf. Lycos. He was a legend, a creature of myth. A shadow beast larger than any 3 wolves combined, his fur the color of a starless midnight. But now he was collapsed on the frozen earth, his massive form racked with tremors. A faint, sickly gray light seemed to be leaching from his fur, and his breaths came in ragged, painful pants. The sound of his suffering was a physical blow. She knew she should not be there. To be found meant a flogging, or worse, exile into the frozen wastes. But she could not move. Her heart ached with a sympathy so fierce it was an agony of its own. Without thinking, without understanding why, she began to hum. It was an old song, a wordless melody her mother had sung to her in a life she could barely remember. A life before she was an orphan, before she was unclaimed. It was a song of warmth, of safety, of peace. The great wolf's head lifted, his ears twitching, his eyes glowing with a faint dying silver light, found her. A low growl rumbled in his chest, but it was weak, lacking its usual terror. She took a hesitant step closer, her humming growing a little stronger, weaving a fragile blanket of sound in the cold air. "It's all right," she whispered, the words a plume of white in the moonlight. You're all right. Lycos whined, a sound so pitiful from such a fearsome creature that it broke her heart. He laid his head back down, his trembling lessening just a fraction. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, humming her forgotten lullaby to the dying soul of the Alpha King's wolf, until his breathing evened out into a shallow, fitful sleep. Only then did she become aware of another presence. Hidden in the deep shadows of a stone archway, a figure stood motionless. The king. He had been there the whole time, watching her. She couldn't see his face, but she felt his gaze like a brand on her skin. She saw the glint of his eyes, burning with an intensity that was terrifying and unreadable. Panic finally seized her. She turned and fled, her heart hammering against her ribs, her slippers silent on the frost-kissed stone. She didn't look back. She ran to the safety of her tiny, cold room in the servants' quarters, burrowed under her thin blanket, and waited for the guards to come for her. But they never came. The next day, she went about her duties in a haze of terror, expecting at any moment to feel a heavy hand on her shoulder. She avoided the royal wing, trading her cleaning duties with another girl for the much harder work in the main kitchens. She scrubbed pots until her arms ached, the steam and noise a welcome shield. King Theron made an appearance at the midday meal, striding into the great hall with his usual imposing grace. He looked no different. His face was the same cold, handsome mask. His eyes were the same stormy gray. If he was grieving for his fading companion, he showed no sign of it. His gaze swept the room, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping second, it seemed to pass over her. But there was no recognition. Nothing. He looked right through her, as if she were made of glass. She felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Relief, yes, but also a strange, sharp sting of disappointment. He was going to pretend it never happened. She was safe. She was still invisible. That night, when she returned to her cell-like room, exhausted and smelling of grease and wood smoke, something was waiting for her. Lying on the rough spun blanket that served as her mattress was a single, worn leather glove. It was huge, clearly made for a man's hand, the leather softened with age and use. It wasn't new or valuable, but it was unmistakably an item of quality. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. It was still faintly warm, as if recently held. She lifted it to her face and inhaled. The scent of pine, old leather, and something else. Something wild and masculine that was uniquely King Theron filled her senses. Her heart began to pound. Where had this come from? No one ever came to her room. No one would dare leave her a gift. It was a mistake. It had to be. But as she looked at the doorway, she saw it. A single, massive paw print in the dust of the corridor, already fading. Lycos. The king's wolf had brought her his master's glove. She hid the glove beneath her mattress, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. It was a test, or a trap. The king was playing some cruel game with her before he cast her out. There was no other explanation. The next day passed in a blur of anxiety. She watched Theron from afar, searching his face for any sign, any clue. But there was only the same cold control. He spoke with his advisors, issued commands, and ruled his mountain fortress with an iron will. He never looked her way. He pretended not to notice her existence. But that night, there was another gift. This time it was a small, smooth river stone, polished to a dull sheen. It was a worry stone, the kind a man might keep in his pocket, turning it over and over with his thumb. It felt cool and solid in her palm. It smelled faintly of him. And again, the single, fading paw print in the dust outside her door. This was not a mistake. The king's wolf was courting her. The thought was so absurd, so impossible that she almost laughed, but the evidence was undeniable. His human form ignored her, treated her like thin air, but his wolf, his very soul, was seeking her out. Why? Was it because she had soothed him in the garden? Was it a simple animal gratitude? Or was it something more? The deepest, most forbidden parts of her heart dared to whisper a word she hadn't allowed herself to think in years. Mate. She crushed the thought instantly. It was a path to madness. The Alpha King was a pureblood, a descendant of the first wolf. She was nothing. Unclaimed. Astray. The goddess would never sanction such a bond. It was impossible. The gifts continued. A silver cloak pin, simple but elegant, bearing the faint scratch marks of canine teeth. A strip of dried, spiced meat, the kind only served at the king's high table. A single, perfect feather from a snow eagle, a rare and revered bird of the highest peaks. Each morning she would find a new treasure, and each day she would watch the king as he pretended not to notice. He would walk down the same corridor, his guards flanking him, his stormy eyes fixed straight ahead. He would pass her small room, past the very spot where his wolf had laid a gift hours before, and his expression would not so much as flicker. He knew. She was certain of it. Sometimes she would feel the weight of his gaze for a fraction of a second before he turned away. She saw the minute tension in his jaw as he passed her. He was not ignoring her. He was actively, forcefully pretending she did not exist. The disconnect was tearing her apart. The wolf's silent, gentle offerings made her heart ache with a fragile, dangerous hope. The king's cold, deliberate rejection shattered it every single day. One of his senior advisors, a calm, silver-haired man named Lord Valerius, began to take notice of her. He was one of the few people who spoke to the king with any familiarity. His face was kind, his eyes gentle. "You are Ilara, are you not?" he asked one afternoon, stopping her in the hall. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "Yes, my lord. I have seen you. You are a hard worker." He smiled, a warm, paternal expression. "Such diligence should not be spent in the scullery. I am assigning you to the royal library. The work is lighter, quieter." She could only stammer her thanks, utterly bewildered. The library was a place of honor, a sanctuary of knowledge. Why would he choose her? "The king values loyalty and quiet competence," Valerius said, as if reading her mind. "He may not show it, but he notices such things." The new position was a blessing. She spent her days surrounded by the scent of old paper and leather, carefully dusting ancient scrolls and organizing tomes. It was peaceful. But it also brought her closer to the king's orbit. His private study adjoined the library. Sometimes she would hear his deep, rumbling voice through the thick oak door, and she would freeze, her hand hovering over a book, her breath caught in her chest. The gifts from Lycos became more personal. One night, she found a small carved wooden wolf, its head tilted as if listening. It was an old toy, perhaps. Something from his childhood. The intimacy of it made her blush. Another night, it was a book of poetry, its spine cracked, a single passage marked. The poem spoke of a winter soul finding a spark of unexpected spring. She was living in two worlds, the cold, silent world of the dutiful librarian and the secret, magical world of a girl being courted by a phantom wolf. And all the while, the man who was the center of it all acted as if she were a ghost. The tension was becoming unbearable. The hope was a poison, seeping into her veins, making her long for something she could never have. This strange, silent courtship was a sweet torture. One evening, while working late in the library, she heard a crash from the king's study. It was followed by a low groan of pain. Protocol demanded she fetch the guard. Protocol demanded she do nothing, that she pretend she hadn't heard. She ignored protocol. Her hand trembled as she pushed open the heavy door. The room was lit only by a dying fire. King Theron was on his knees, his broad shoulders slumped, one hand braced against his heavy desk. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, his jaw clenched in agony, and she saw it again. The faint, sickly gray light was shimmering around him, leeching the strength from his body. It was his wolf. Lycos was fading, and he was taking the king with him. "Your Majesty?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. His head snapped up. His storm gray eyes widened, first with shock, then with a raw, desperate fury. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice a rasp. "Now!" But she didn't move. She saw past the anger to the fear beneath it. He was terrified. He was dying, and he was utterly alone. The same instinct that had moved her in the garden moved her now. She walked toward him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I said get out," he roared, trying to push himself up, but his strength failed him. He collapsed back, his breath hissing through his teeth. She knelt in front of him. She didn't know what to do, what to say. So she did the only thing she could think of. She reached out and placed her small, trembling hand on his arm. The moment her skin touched the fabric of his tunic, a jolt went through him. A shudder racked his massive frame. The gray light around him flickered, and for a moment it receded, pushed back by some invisible force emanating from her. His ragged breathing eased slightly. He stared at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. The fury in his eyes was gone, replaced by a stunned, aching vulnerability that shattered her. This was the man behind the mask, the soul connected to the wolf who left her gifts. "How?" he breathed, the word full of disbelief and a desperate, fragile hope. "I don't know," she answered honestly. They stayed like that for a long moment, the silence of the room broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of his unsteady breathing. Her touch seemed to be anchoring him, holding the gray sickness at bay. Slowly, carefully, he reached up with his free hand and cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch so gentle, so reverent, it made her want to weep. It was a touch full of all the things his words and his public face denied. "My wolf," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "He chose you from the moment he heard you, that night in the garden." Her breath hitched. So he did know. He knew everything. "He is fading," Theron continued, his voice strained. "He has been for years, a slow decay no healer can stop. When he is gone, I will follow." The stark confession hung in the air between them. This was his secret. The source of the emptiness she had always sensed in him. The great Alpha King was dying. "He brings me things," she whispered, the confession her own. A shadow of a smile touched his lips, a sad, beautiful expression. "I know. He steals them when he thinks I'm not looking. He is a stubborn, sentimental beast." His eyes held hers, and the vulnerability there was absolute. "He believes you are his last hope, our last hope." This was too much. The king, the gifts, the secret illness. Her mind was reeling. Why do you pretend?" she asked, the question that had tormented her for weeks. "Why do you look through me?" The pain that filled his eyes was a physical blow. "Because it is cruel to give a dying man's mate hope," he said, his voice breaking on the word mate. "Because every moment my wolf connects with you, he burns a little brighter, and the fading becomes faster when you are gone. You are both his salvation and his end." He finally said it. "Mate?" The impossible word was real. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm on her skin. He smelled of pine and winter and a deep, soul-crushing sorrow. "Ilara," he whispered her name, and the sound of it on his lips was both a prayer and a curse. "I am so sorry. I tried to stay away. I tried to protect you from this." Before she could process it, before she could find her voice to respond, the door to the study swung open. Lord Valerius stood there, his kind face etched with concern. "Your Majesty?" "I heard a noise." His eyes darted from the kneeling king to Ilara, her hand still on Theron's arm. His expression hardened for a fraction of a second before the gentle mask slipped back into place. "The girl is tiring you. You must rest." Theron pulled away from her, the effort costing him dearly. The cold mask of the king was back, but she could see the cracks. "Leave us, Valerius." "Of course, your majesty." The advisor bowed, but his eyes, when they met Ilara's, were cold. There was no warmth in them now. There was only a quiet, calculating threat. "Come, child. You are needed elsewhere." She didn't want to leave him. Her hand felt empty and cold without the contact. But to defy the king's most trusted advisor was unthinkable. She gave Theron one last desperate look and allowed Valerius to lead her from the room. "The king's condition is delicate," Valerius said smoothly as they walked down the silent corridor. His hand was on her elbow, his grip surprisingly firm. "He must not be agitated. Your presence seems to disturb him." "It helps him?" she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "My touch, it helps his wolf." Valerius stopped, turning to face her. The paternal kindness was gone completely, replaced by a chilling condescension. "You are an unclaimed servant girl. You are confused. The king is unwell, and his mind plays tricks on him. You will stay away from him from now on. For his own good." The words were a command, wrapped in the guise of concern. It was also a lie. She had seen the truth in Theron's eyes. She had felt the effect she had on him. "He is my mate," she said, the words tasting strange and powerful on her tongue. Valerius actually laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "My dear girl, you have been reading too many fairy tales in that library. An alpha king does not mate with nothing. Now, go back to your duties and forget these delusions. If you bother His Majesty again, I will have you sent to the deepest ice cells. Do you understand me?" The threat was real. The malice in his eyes was undeniable. He wasn't trying to protect Theron, he was trying to isolate him. From her. She nodded, lowering her eyes in feigned submission. "Yes, my lord." He released her arm and walked away, leaving her alone in the cold stone hallway, her heart a block of ice in her chest. The gifts from Lycos stopped. Her doorway was empty each morning. The silence was more painful than the king's cold shoulder had ever been. Valerius had somehow prevented the wolf from reaching her. The fortress felt colder, emptier. The fragile thread of hope that had sustained her was gone. Days turned into a week. There was no sign of the king. Rumors began to spread through the castle like a plague. The king was ill. The king was sequestered. Lord Valerius was handling all matters of state, his control absolute. He assured the Pack Council that the king was merely resting, recovering from a seasonal ailment, but Ilara knew it was a lie. Theron was dying, and Valerius was letting it happen. She had to do something. She was his mate. She was his only hope. The thought was no longer a delusion. It was a certainty that burned in her soul. She tried to get to the royal wing, but guards loyal to Valerius were posted at every entrance. They turned her away with cold, dismissive glares. She was once again the invisible girl, the nothing. Desperation clawed at her. She felt Theron's fading strength as a constant ache in her own chest, a phantom pain from a bond that had barely been allowed to form. She could feel him slipping away. One night, she was huddled in her room, staring at the small collection of treasures Lycos had brought her, the glove, the stone, the carved wolf. They were all she had left of him. A faint scratching sound at her door made her jump. She opened it a crack. An old, grizzled wolf from the kennels stood there, one she had often been kind to, slipping him extra scraps. He looked up at her with intelligent eyes, then nudged a small, folded piece of parchment toward her with his nose before turning and trotting silently away. Her hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was weak, scrawled, but unmistakably Theron's. "He keeps you from me. The poison. It is old. Valerius, my wolf is almost gone. Run, Ilara. Run before he finds a reason to silence you for good. Forget me. Poison." Valerius had been poisoning him. Slowly, for years, weakening him, fading his wolf, waiting for the moment to seize control. The advisor's kindness had been a mask for a viper. And now he saw her as a threat to his plans. The message told her to run, to save herself. She folded the parchment, her decision made in an instant. She would not run. She was the mate of the Alpha King. She would not abandon him to a traitor. If she was going to die, she would die at his side. She knew one way into the royal wing that no one ever guarded. A narrow, crumbling maintenance tunnel behind the library's great fireplace, used centuries ago by servants and long since forgotten. It was dark, filled with cobwebs and the scuttling of unseen things, but it led directly to the back of the king's chambers. Taking a deep breath, she pulled a loose stone from the fireplace and slipped into the suffocating darkness. She navigated by touch, her hands scraping against rough-hewn rock, the air thick with the dust of ages. It felt like being buried alive. After what seemed like an eternity, her searching fingers found the outline of another loose panel. She pushed. It gave way with a groan, and she tumbled out into the cold, still air of Theron's bedchamber. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. A single candle flickered on a bedside table, casting long, dancing shadows. Theron lay on the massive bed, so still she thought for a terrifying moment that she was too late. The gray, sickly light of his fading life force was now a thick shroud around him, so dim it was barely visible. "Theron," she breathed, rushing to his side. His eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, his focus lost. "Ilara?" he whispered, his voice a ghost of its former power. "You should have run." "I don't run," she said, taking his cold hand in both of hers. It felt like clutching marble. "I am your mate." A flicker of light, of life, returned to his eyes. "My mate," he repeated as if tasting the word. A tear slipped from the corner of his eye and traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. A king should be able to protect his queen. "Let me protect you," she said, pouring all of her will, all of her desperate love into her touch. She felt that familiar connection, the slight pushback against the gray sickness, but it was so much weaker now. He was too far gone. The door to the chamber burst open, flooding the room with light from the hall. Lord Valerius stood there, flanked by two of his personal guards. His kind mask was gone forever, his face a contortion of triumphant fury. "Touching," he sneered. "Such a shame you had to ruin my carefully laid plans, little stray. I had hoped you would be smart enough to disappear." "You poisoned him," she accused, standing up to face him, positioning herself between the traitor and her king. "Poison is such an ugly word," Valerius said with a dismissive wave. "I merely helped nature along. His bloodline was weakening. It was time for a stronger one to take its place. Mine." He smiled, a predator's grin. "And now I must clean up this last little loose end. Seize her." The guards moved forward. Ilara's mind raced. There was nowhere to run. Theron was helpless behind her. This was the end. They would drag her away, kill her, and Valerius would be king. As the first guard reached for her, a primal, desperate instinct roared to life inside her. It was a refusal. A refusal to let this happen. A refusal to let her mate die. A refusal to be the victim, the nothing, the unclaimed girl any longer. She didn't know how it happened. She didn't consciously do anything. A light erupted from her. It wasn't a fire, and it wasn't lightning. It was a wave of pure, golden energy, the color of the sun at dawn, bursting from her chest in a silent, concussive wave. It was the essence of life itself, a power that had lain dormant in her blood for generations, a bloodline ability, forgotten by the world. The two guards were thrown back against the wall as if struck by a battering ram, slumping to the ground, unconscious. Valerius stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, shielding his face with his arm. "What is this? What are you?" She didn't answer. She felt the power coursing through her veins, warm and vast and terrifying. It was a part of her she had never known existed. It felt like coming home. She turned from the stunned traitor and looked back at Theron. The golden light was flowing from her, pouring into him, drawn by the desperate call of the mate bond. It enveloped the sickly gray shroud, not fighting it, but consuming it, transforming it. The dimming silver light of his wolf, Lycos, suddenly blazed to life within the golden aura. It was no longer fading. It was feeding. It was healing. Theron's body arched on the bed, a deep guttural roar tearing from his throat, a sound of agony and rebirth. His eyes flew open, no longer cloudy, but blazing with the pure silver fire of a fully awakened alpha. Power, raw and untamed, rolled off him in waves, shaking the very stones of the room. He sat up, his body no longer frail, but crackling with energy. He looked at his hands, then at Ilara, who stood bathed in the soft, receding golden glow of her own power. Awe and a love so profound it was breathtaking filled his face. "Ilara," he breathed. Valerius, recovering his senses, saw his victory slipping away. With a snarl of rage, he drew a dagger hidden in his tunic, its blade coated with a black, viscous substance. The poison. He lunged, not at the recovering king, but at Ilara. "If I can't have the throne," he shrieked, "I'll take his heart." He was fast, but Theron was faster. In a blur of motion, the king was off the bed, his form shifting and expanding. He didn't fully become the wolf, but he took on its aspects. His features sharpened, his eyes blazed silver, and his hands became tipped with black, vicious claws. He intercepted Valerius's lunge, his clawed hand catching the traitor's wrist in a grip of iron. The dagger clattered to the floor. "You are a fool, Valerius," Theron growled, his voice a terrifying mix of man and beast. "You thought my bloodline was weak. You were wrong. It was merely waiting for its other half." He twisted. A sickening crack echoed in the room, and Valerius crumpled to the ground, his life extinguished. Silence descended. The only sounds were their two heartbeats, one strong and steady, the other frantic and fluttering. Theron let the feral power recede, his form returning to normal, though the silver light in his eyes remained, brighter and stronger than ever before. He turned to her. He didn't walk. He glided across the room, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped before her, raising a hand to cup her face, his touch as reverent as it had been in his study. "My mate," he said, the words no longer a lament, but a declaration, a victory. "My queen." "I didn't know," she whispered, her body still trembling from the aftershocks of her power. "I didn't know I could do that." "I did," he said, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Not with my mind, but my soul knew. Lycos knew. From the moment you hummed that song, he knew you were the missing piece, the fire to my winter." He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her, holding her so tightly she could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her own. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. "You saved me," he murmured into her hair. "You saved us." "You were going to let yourself die," she accused softly, her hands clinging to the back of his tunic. "You were going to leave me." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his own filled with a fierce, repentant shame. "Never again. I was a fool to think a life without you was any life at all. I will spend the rest of my days making it up to you." He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made and a future claimed. It was the sealing of a bond, not by law or ceremony, but by fire and soul and a love that had refused to die. Her dormant power surged to meet his, a dance of gold and silver, and in that moment, she was no longer unclaimed. She was anchored. She was home. Months later, the mountain fortress felt different. Warmer. The ancient stones seemed to have soaked up the light that now lived within their queen. Laughter was heard more often in the great hall, and the ever-present chill seemed to have lost its bite. Ilara stood on a balcony overlooking the snow-covered peaks, a thick wolf fur cloak wrapped around her shoulders. It was Theron's, and it smelled of him. A heavy, comforting weight. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar chin rested on her shoulder. What is my queen contemplating so seriously? Theron's voice rumbled against her ear. That I used to be afraid of the cold, she said, leaning back against his solid warmth. And now? Now I think it just needed a little sun. He chuckled, a deep, rich sound she had come to adore. He turned her in his arms, his silver eyes glowing with a love that still made her breath catch. The pack had been shocked by the revelation of Valerius's treason and the existence of their king's true mate. But when they saw the strength that now radiated from their alpha and the quiet, unshakable power of the woman at his side, their shock had turned to fierce, unwavering loyalty. Her bloodline, it turned out, was that of the first healers, a line thought lost to time, whose life-giving magic was the destined counterpart to the Alpha King's primal power. A massive, dark head nudged her hand. Lycos sat at her feet, his fur a deep, glossy black, his silver eyes bright and intelligent. He was larger and more powerful than ever, a living shadow of his master's strength. He licked her hand, a gesture of deep affection and contentment. He no longer needed to bring her secret gifts. He had brought her his king, and that was enough. He's happy, she murmured, stroking the great wolf's head. We all are, Theron said softly, his gaze tender. You woke us up, Alara. You woke up this entire mountain. She was no longer the invisible girl, the unclaimed stray. She was the queen, the mate, the other half of the soul of the pack. She had found her place not through submission or survival, but by unleashing the power that had been sleeping in her blood all along. She looked out at the vast, wild kingdom that was now her home, held safe in the arms of her king, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely warm.